Hi there, this is Evan here, also known as Molendinarius, and I'm reading from Attridge's well-weighed Syllables, which is a study on the Elizabethan attempt to write English poetry using classical Latin meter. And the section follows on from a previous video when I discussed the problems of Latin prosody, and now I'm going to discuss the reading of Latin verse and what the current academic view is on the matter. So Attridge writes, the second major problem, closely associated with the first, is that of the actual reading aloud of quantitative verse. Now this is something I'm very interested in, and as I said in the previous video, I've been very reluctant to read a lot of Latin verse out loud for public consumption because I'm not convinced in myself of the theoretical framework and my application of that theoretical framework. So what I will be doing in future is I will be reading examples of verse, but I'll be discussing the choices I've made in terms of the theoretical framework that applies to the way it's being read. Because without that, it's hard to justify what one's doing, because it's very problematic how we apply the understanding the Romans had to a performance reading of Latin poetry. This is a separate issue from writing the poetry. That the rules for that are more established. So the second major problem, says Attridge, closely associated with the first, is that of the actual reading aloud of quantitative verse. The structural basis of the lines is, as we have seen, the patterned arrangement of heavy and light syllables. But the crucial question is whether this pattern emerges naturally from a reading of the lines as if they were prose, or whether a special mode of delivery is necessary to bring out what is only latent. And then he says, I shall take an example, the dactylic hexameter, since this is the verse form that was most discussed and imitated by the Elizabethan experimenters in quantitative verse. And the dactylic hexameter is made up of 6 feet, of which the first 4 are either dactyl, so, or spondees. And the 5th is generally a dactyl. And the last is a spondee. Although, as in most types of line, the quantity of the final syllable, which he says he marks here throughout as long, in fact is variable. And thus the line most often quoted, the most famous line in Latin literature, in classical Latin literature, in discussions of Renaissance discussions of Latin meter, is the first line of the Aeneid, which is arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris. Right, I'll do that again. Right? Now I'm reading it arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris. Now, the technical term for the metrical beat, which I haven't given you here, I've just been reading it more or less as prose, enunciated or imagined on the first heavy syllable of each foot in quantitative verse is called ictus. So that would be like this. Arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris. And I'll do that again. Arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris. Now this is the metrical beat, the ictus. And one way of pronouncing the line is to give it what is called a stressed ictus reading. So, arma virumque canotrae qui primus aboris. Now imagine doing that for 1,000 lines of Virgil. You'd start going slightly cuckoo after the first 5 lines, and certainly anyone listening to anything read out using that way of reading will have to have had a lot of patience or some kind of sadomasochistic appreciation of poetry. Anyway, that is the way we read it in the classroom when we are teaching ourselves Latin versification. This is the stressed ictus reading. In other words, you ignore the normal stress that's used in prose. And the great problem with this is that students of Latin don't get exposed to a lot of spoken Latin, and the little bit of spoken Latin that they do get exposed to is when they read out loud their poetry with this stressed ictus reading. But the problem is, as they are not native Latin speakers, they then learn the stresses in all the wrong places in the words. Because when a Roman picked up a poem, then he just read it like it was prose, and the poem just fell into place. But in the classroom, a Roman student would be taught a stressed ictus reading as a way of understanding how the poem was constructed, but not as a way of reading it aloud for enjoyment and pleasure. So now Attridge writes here, I'm assuming, he says, the Latin accent was a stress accent, even though this is a matter of dispute. Some authorities holding it was a pitch accent. But we've already noted, he said, that pitch plays an important part in stress. And so the two kinds of accent are perhaps not as distinct as is often thought. Generally speaking, when you get louder and stressed, your pitch changes. So these two things are closely allied. So if you do this and you read it with the ictus reading, then you end up with what I read before, and he goes through it again. We'll do it again. So I'm just going to do it now without the vowel lengths, just focusing on the stress. So arma virumque canotrae qui primus aboris. Right, just and this gives a very definite rhythm, right? Especially to ears accustomed to stressed-based meters like those of the English language. And this is a method, as Attridge writes, which has long been common in schools. In fact, it's universal. And if you go on YouTube and you listen to people reading Latin poetry, they'll be doing this kind of stressed-based reading because their teacher hasn't told them that this is not the way that Latin poetry was actually read. It's just a technique that's used to show students the syllable boundaries and the feet. So, some scholars, writes Attridge, have attempted a defense of this method, not merely as a pedagogic device, but as the correct way of reading Latin verse. So there are some, not very many, mind you, and the number has decreased dramatically over the years. So among more recent arguments in favor of some kind of stressed ictus reading of Latin poetry are Herescu, writing in 1960, and Allen in 1964, but then Allen changed his mind. And when he published in 1973, he decided that his first opinion, based on new evidence, was not correct. And Coleman, writing in 1968, I'm not aware of anyone more recently who's adopted this view, and the weight of authority from the Romans seems to indicate not. The more common and the most convincing argument is that the normal prose accentuation should be used when reading a line of Latin verse. And this makes sense if you think about it, like the poems of Horace, Catullus, were famous across the Roman Empire, and the Roman, they were everywhere. You find them all over the place, even Hadrian's Wall and places like that. So these things were read everywhere. The average person would have just picked them up and read them out in the way they spoke their Latin, without any particular sitting down with a pencil to mark out everything, to work out where all the boundaries were and to put in the ictus. Quite an involved procedure which would totally destroy the accessibility of the poetry. And it would mean that nobody, unless they were highly educated, would be able to read the poetry, which is a nonsense. So, to recap, he says the more common and convincing argument is that the normal prose accentuation should be used when reading a line of Latin verse. So, here we have Arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris. Arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris. Now, it's possible that the stress of virumque fell on virumque. And if I read it that way, notice this. Arma virumque cano. And then we don't have this tension that exists on the unstressed final syllable of cano, which if you read it arma virumque cano, it sounds unnatural and forced. But if the stress, the natural word stress, is on the first syllable of virumque, in other words, falling on the natural location of the word virum, with the enclitic que not moving it, which does happen, and there's an argument about how frequently this happened, that the stress would move. I don't think it does move here. So, arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris. The rules of Latin verse, writes Attridge, prevent the complete coincidence of accent and ictus in the majority of lines. So if you read the ictal reading, you're going to have the stress in the wrong place on a lot of words. So rules such as those which govern the placing of caesuras, and a caesura is a break between words that occurs inside a foot. It's a structural thing. The question is, should the caesura appear in your actual reading, or is it just part of the substructure? In the hexameter, for example, a caesura must occur in the third foot, either after the first syllable, which is a strong caesura, or less commonly after the second syllable of a dactyl, which is a weak caesura. In which case, says Attridge, it is usually accompanied by a strong caesura in the second and another one in the fourth foot. Furthermore, notes Attridge, word division seldom occurs at the end of the second foot unless it also has a caesura. The effect of these rules, given the fact that no Latin polysyllable is stressed on the final syllable, is to prevent the coincidence of stress and ictus in the center of the line of Latin poetry. And so, in the line already quoted, the strong caesura after cano ensures that the stress cannot fall on the first syllable of the third foot. And at the end of the line, however, the tendency of the classical hexameter is to end in words of 2 or 3 syllables, and to avoid an ending of 2 disyllables unless they are preceded by a monosyllable. And this has the opposite effect of preventing a clash of stress and ictus, because the stress will always fall on the first syllable of both final feet, and only very uncommonly on other syllables of those feet. So proponents of this ictal method of reading assume that, given the correct, proponents of the natural method of reading Latin poetry, assume that given the correct pronunciation of Latin, the quantitative pattern which, as we saw in the last little talk I gave, is often understood to be a durational pattern, thus encouraging at times a rendering with strict time values, which our discussion of quantity has shown to be unnecessary. And you will find on YouTube some people have read Latin poetry and have actually put a metrical metronome, tick-tock, accompaniment to it. And this sounds very forced. Once again, if you were to read Virgil, 1,000 lines of Virgil, or even 100 lines of Virgil, using such a forced metrical method, it would sound ridiculous, and you wouldn't want to listen to it after 3 lines. It would just not be worth listening to. It would be boring, you wouldn't be able to get any emotion into it, and be mechanical. So this is not to be done, although some people have attempted to do it. And it's an interesting exercise, but in my view, a completely useless one, unless you're in the classroom and you're trying to demonstrate the structure of the poem as a purely interesting artifact, but nothing to do with performance poetry. So he says that the pattern will emerge in spite of the fact that the stresses do not fall in a corresponding pattern. The argument is usually taken further, and the changing relationship between accent and quantity is seen as a deliberate device whereby the expressive possibilities are greatly increased. It is held, and I think this is a lot of nonsense as well, but it is held by some that the reader perceives a quantitative patterning and the occurrence of the stresses simultaneously, and that the poet can use this interplay between the ictus and the natural stress for poetic effects, while the basic rhythmic structure is asserted by the coincidence at the end of every line. This, of course, assumes that the reader knows where all the ictuses are falling because they've gone through it with a red pen, and then while they're listening to the natural reading, their minds are also somehow paying attention to those little red pen marks, which are not actually there in terms of the pronunciation. They're just understood to be there. And I just don't think that our minds do that when we're reading poetry, any more than we think of, the beat marks in a piece of music by Mozart. We listen to it, but we're not parsing it musically, we're just enjoying it. And the same is true of poetry. Poetry is primarily about emotion and communication. And this, of course, is just all the structure to put it into place. This view of hexameter was fully elaborated by somebody called Jackson Knight in 1939 and is exemplified by Wilkinson in 1963, and it calls it the pulse accent theory. And Wilkinson quotes several instances of the expressive use of what he calls coincidence and clash with classical Latin hexameters. And then he gives 3 examples here to illustrate the theory. And the complete absence of clashing feet is sometimes obtained by a weak 3rd foot caesura without the accompanying strong caesuras, and thus the meter contributes to the sense of ease in the following line from the Aeneid. That's book 4, line 486. So if we read through this just as prose, so spargens umida mella soperifumque papaver. Now let's have a look at that with the ictus. Spargens umida mella soporiferumque papaver. Now, if you know anything about where Latin stresses fall, you can hear the rhythm of the ictus, but it doesn't sound natural. I'll do it again. So, spargens umida mella soporiferumque papaver. Right? so that's the ictus. Whereas if you were reading it for a prose reading, you go spargens umidamella soperiferum que papaver. And the disruptive effect of even a strong third foot caesura can be minimized, as in the Aeneid, Book 6, line 523, where the momentary tension, writes Attridge, on quies is released in the smooth dactyls that follow. So let's look at this in the ictal reading first. So, dulcis et alta quies placidaeque simillima mortis. I'll read that again. Dulcis et alta quies placidaeque simillima mortis. That's the ictal reading. And dulcis et alta quies placidaeque similia mortis. And when the desired effect is one of harshness, however, the first part of a line can be made to be a succession of clashes, as in the description of the shipwrecked men in the Aeneid, Book 1, line 118. Right? So let's do this with the parent rari nantes in gurgite summo. And that would give us a very different thing. So it's a neat and attractive theory, but as it stands, it is not entirely satisfactory, this idea of clash between the ictus and the natural stress. And the reason for this, writes Attridge, is the possibility of holding in mind two different patterns and actually experiencing the clash or coincidence as an expressive aspect of verse has not been demonstrated. In other words, this is an interesting academic exercise to conduct with a pen in your armchair, but if someone's actually there reading the poetry in a meaningful way, then no. So, a comparison has been drawn with English, but there's really no parallel, since the commonly held view that part of the expressiveness of English verse comes from the relationship between the regular meter and the actual rhythm of the words relies on the fact that the actual rhythm departs from the metrical base only in very limited ways in English, and moreover, one's sense of the metrical base springs directly from one's awareness of the rhythm and is not derived from a pattern in a different medium. And then Attridge says this: it is not surprising, he says, that textbooks generally omit discussion of the problem. So here we have all these Latin students all over the world studying how to read Latin poetry, and all their textbooks totally gloss over this issue because it's so difficult. I would swear here, it's so difficult. It's extremely difficult. And they gloss over all the formalities involved. One solution is simply to teach an ictal reading and throw everything away, all these complexities out the window, and a lot of Latin teachers opt for this simply because it's easy, not because it's right. And the textbooks, as I say, omit the problem and gloss over the difficulties. So Raven, 1965, states the thorny question of ictus has, for better or worse, been disregarded throughout this work. And Cooper, writing in 1952, insists that the ictus is manifested by stress, but later he says that the hexameter must be read with normal word accents, totally contradicting himself. The existence of so much disagreement and uncertainty in present-day discussions, and these continue on, should encourage some leniency in our judgment of the attempts made by the Elizabethans, writes Attridge, in their understanding of Latin meter, and the prevalence of false and unexamined views on the subject even today should make it easier for us to accept the apparently unthinking way in which educated Elizabethans accepted and passed on a conception of meter founded on inconsistencies and errors. Perhaps, writes Attridge, and this is an interesting proposition, something that's worth thinking about, perhaps we assume too readily that the Romans themselves possessed the key to their own verse, simply because they produced systematized rules as an aid to its creation. In other words, that one thing doesn't necessarily mean the other. It doesn't mean the Romans actually understood what they were doing in a theoretical sense. They were doing it. We know that they composed their verse out loud. Virgil would speak out loud. They would do this aloud and then go by the sound of things and how they sounded. And the analysis possibly came later. Oh, that sounds right. Let's check if it works, kind of thing. Or perhaps they just went on sound and it always just worked if you were as good a poet as Virgil. Perhaps we assume too readily that the Romans themselves possessed the key to their verse, simply because they produced systematized rules as an aid to its creation, to read those lines again. After all, we are still a long way from understanding the operation of traditional English meter. Is it more likely that the Romans or Greeks understood theirs? In other words, we have these problems in contemporary poetry, traditional English poetry analysis, in our own language, in English language. Why? And we have far more apparatus and scholarly material and theoretical bases on which to build than the Romans did, and we still have trouble. Add to this fact that quantitative Latin verse was the result of an attempt to impose upon one language a metrical system natural to another language, and a very different language at that, ancient Greek, while the natural Latin system of stressed-based verse apparently remained in existence in popular tradition, and one sees that Roman accounts of their meter must be treated with caution. He notes here that an interesting example of the difficulty experienced by classical Latin poets when a natural property of Latin contradicted a rule inherited from the Greeks can be seen in the final treatment of a final lax vowel followed by an initial S consonant. Greek rules of versification made the syllable heavy, but Latin syllabification left it light. And the result of this conflict was, for the most part, the avoidance of this combination by Latin poets. Now, writes Attridge, in view of the praise lavished for centuries upon Latin poetry and its beautiful rhythms by readers whose pronunciation of the language could have given them no oral appreciation of the quantitative meter intended by the poets, is it not possible that the Romans, imitating the Greeks in their poetry as in their sculpture and as in their architecture, should have exaggerated the importance of the quantitative aspect of the new meters? So, for example, Westerway, writing in 1913, in discussing the reformed Latin pronunciation, which at this time was taking over in England and replacing the traditional English pronunciation of Latin, which has now been extinguished pretty much. You don't hear it anymore. So Professor Sainsbury tells the Times that he plumps for the old pronunciation because it is more likely to bring home to an English boy the beauty of Latin literature. There are probably not a few scholars whose keen appreciation of the music of their Horace and their Virgil is so intimately associated with the pronunciation of a lifetime that they cannot bring themselves to make a change. And of course this is the origin of the so-called pronunciation wars between the restored classical pronunciation of Latin, which attempts to work out what the Romans were doing, and more medieval-based continental pronunciations. Before the 1800s, there were a large number of variant continental pronunciations, vastly different from one another. These, over the course of time, have become crystallized down, and people tend to talk about the ecclesiastical pronunciation and the restored classical pronunciation, as though there were only two pronunciations of Latin in existence, whereas in fact, across Europe to this day, there are a number of variant national pronunciations of Latin, fewer than before, and the restored classical is slowly edging out these medieval variants. Waltz, writing in 1949, in considering the history of the word rhythmos, concludes that whereas for the Greeks the idea of rhythm suggested movement, for the Romans, moins artistes que calculateurs, less artists than calculators. He was saying that the Romans were mechanics of poetry. The Greeks were naturals at it. So says Waltz. It conveyed the sense of measure and number. Now, the Romans no doubt admired and took pleasure in the precision and attention to detail of quantitative meters, as later generations have done. And it was to this aspect that they devoted their theoretical attention. It nevertheless seems possible, writes Attridge, as far as rhythmic organization of sound is concerned, that they actually responded to the stress patterns when reading and listening to verse. Because after all, the traditional Latin poetry, the one that came before the Greeks influenced the poetry, was stressed based. And this attitude, Attridge notes in the footnote here, which we shall consider in the Elizabethan context later, has not disappeared. So Kurilovich, I'm not sure how we pronounce that, 1966, states that Greek and Latin poetry, though represented by many works of prominent rank in world literature, impresses us not only by its artistic, but also, sit venia verbo, by its artificial character. And he ascribes this impression in part to the multiple, rigorous, and intricate rules of versification. Notice that in the examples of the expressive use of meter, which we looked at before, the effects discussed are not destroyed if one focuses on accentual rhythm, since the contrast between the harshness of an irregular pattern of stresses and the smoothness of a dactylic or trochaic rhythm is still present. So you can read this in a normal stress-based way, and it works. And Latin poetry does work. We just read it with a normal stress word accent. So a metrical form, which furnishes further evidence of the importance of the accentual pattern in Latin poetry, is the sapphic. And because of this, and its importance in the history of English prosody, it merits separate consideration. Horace made extensive use of the sapphic stanza, which was, of course, Greek in origin, and in doing so introduced certain restrictions on the meter, which had the effect of giving it a distinct accentual character. The longer lines of a stanza have the following quantitative pattern. So I'm going to skim through them here. So it's long, short, long, short, long, short, short, long, short, long, long, or long, short, long, short, long, short, short, long, short, long, long. Horace, however, does not allow the fourth syllable to be light, and he introduces a caesura after the fifth syllable, and these two restrictions combine to limit greatly the number of accentual patterns that are possible. Whether or not he made these changes for this reason is not important here. Wilkinson discusses this, and he says that nothing was further from his thoughts, and that his increasing use of a caesura after the sixth rather than after the fifth syllable in his later sapphics is the result of the realization that his audience was paying attention to an irrelevant accentual rhythm. Possibly. The fact remains that a large number of his sapphics have this rhythm, which can best be indicated by quoting one of the odes, with here the accents, he's marked them out. And let's have a look at this. Persicos odi puer apparatus displicent nexae. I'm reading it very mechanically here and slowly. Pilira coronae mitte sectari rosa quo locorum serra moretur. Simplici mirto nihil al labores sedulus curo neque te ministrum dedicit mirtus neque me sub arta vitae bibentem. Right, not the most expressive reading, but I'm not aiming for that. As is clear from these lines, the pattern is one of stresses on the first, fourth, sixth, and 10th syllables. Right? So, persicos odi puer apparatus. Right? That's with the long and short syllables marked with the sound of the drum. So it's long, short, long, 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 short, short, long, short, long, long. Right? And then when we do that with the natural stress accent, I'm just going to read the first line. So, persicos odi puer apparatus. And you can do these experiments yourself. I think these beating out with the drum, etc., like that, is not particularly useful in terms of, as I said, reading the poetry. It's just something that you can do as a tool to understand what's going on. It is difficult to imagine, writes Attridge, that Horace's public read the lines without noticing and responding to the accentual rhythm. Persicos odi puer apparatus displicent nexae pilir coronae, mitte sectari rosa quo locorum serra moretur. And we shall see, says Attridge, when discussing the Elizabethan imitations of the sapphic, that it was this aspect of the sapphic which was seized on by readers from medieval times and onward. If the accentual pattern of Latin verse did play an important part in the response of its readers, it would mean that in spite of the alterations in the pronunciation of Latin since classical times, some of which we shall be considering in the following chapter, one feature of Latin poetry has remained relatively constant, except for those who preferred a stressed ictus reading. So if you're reading with a natural accent pattern, then it doesn't really matter if you're reading using restored classical pronunciation, or you're using an ecclesiastical so-called Roman stressed-based pronunciation, which ignores the long and short vowels. Because the stresses, this aspect of Latin poetry will still be present. So you won't get the entire experience that the Roman poet was aiming at, but the poem is still deliverable. So it's not true that it's not possible to read a Latin poet with a medieval stress-based pronunciation. It is possible, but only part of the of what the Roman poet was trying to achieve is preserved in a totally stress-based reading. So, by the weight, says Attridge, of theoretical attention, he says, but the weight of theoretical attention has always fallen on quantitative structures. So, most writers discussing Roman poetry focus on the thing that's unusual, and that's quantity, even though it's not really understood what quantity is. And this in itself is a massive problem. So then he says, as we move on to consider the Elizabethans, we must bear in mind that the problems with which they grappled even though they seem sometimes to have been unaware of their existence, just like many Latin students nowadays are blissfully unaware of the hazy, murky situation, how unsure we are of so many things. Even though they seem sometimes to be unaware of their existence, these problems, and these problems have to a large extent still not been solved, and they may, as Attridge writes, even have been a problem and a puzzle to the Romans themselves, and that where we have added to our knowledge, we have exposed centuries of careless and self-contradictory thinking on this matter. So this is Attridge on the issue, and the book itself is well worth reading. It's very interesting, and reading the Elizabethan attempts to write quantitative poetry is also extremely interesting and helpful, I believe, for someone trying to read Latin poetry. Yet dying and dead do we sing her honour, so becomes our tombs monuments of her praise, so becomes our loss the triumph of her gain, hers be the glory. So that's, if you are reading a piece of Latin poetry, it should have that kind of sound to it. So reading this Elizabethan quantitative poetry is a good training ground, I think, to let you know more or less what should be happening when you're reading the Latin poetry. Thus do I fall to rise thus do I die to live thus. Changed to a change, I change not. Thus may I not be from you, thus be my senses on you. Thus what I think is of you, thus what I seek is in you. All what I am, it is you. And let's look at this. This is by, I believe, I'm not sure if it's Harvey. This is Harvey. I'll read this one. Unhappy verse, the witness of my unhappy state. Make thyself fluttering wings of thy fast flying. Thought, and fly forth unto my love, wheresoever she be. Whether lying restless in heavy bed, or else sitting so cheerless at the cheerful board, or else playing alone careless on her heavenly virginals. If in bed, tell her that my eyes can take no rest. If at board, tell her that my mouth can eat no meat. If at her virginals, tell her I can hear no mirth. And so on. So if you go on to usedbooksearch.co.uk, you can find Attridge, the well-weighed syllables, for sale. It's a useful book. I'm also going to go through a few other people's more modern analyses of these issues, but the thorny question of quantity remains unresolved, whether it's an issue of vowel length or something to do with the tension of the vowels rather than the duration of the vowels, or maybe tension and duration are related to each other, and what the Romans here heard as length was actually tension, which if you get audacity and you read Latin poetry aloud, it's a worthwhile exercise then to analyze what's going on in your poetry and look at, you can see tension and you can see laxness in the vowels. It comes across on the waveform and the density of the waveform. And that's a useful exercise. So if you're interested in Latin verse and Latin performance poetry, that's something that you could try doing. And as I said, I myself haven't produced much poetical reading of Latin. And the reason for that is I'm still working out my theoretical framework for how to recite Latin verse. And once I've done something that I'm happy with, I'll explain to you where I'm coming from, and then read some Latin verse to you. I've read a bit here and there, using theoretical frameworks developed by others, but I'm not satisfied with anything that I've produced yet. And there are some readers on YouTube who are making an effort, and some of the results are actually very encouraging. But there's still plenty of people trying to do an ictal reading, which is the way the verse was taught in school. I don't really see the point of giving an ictal reading unless you preface it by saying this is an ictal reading. It was used as a teaching technique in the classroom in Roman times, but not as a way of delivering the poem in terms of its performance or for its aesthetic values. So that's that, and more later, I suppose. Bye.